Makonnen Sankofa on Africa's colonization. Makonnen Sankofa is the author of the best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, and he's also the author of the book, Life in Gambia, all of which I've left a link in the description part of this interview for viewers who would love to get a copy directly from Amazon. There is much to know about Makonnen Sankofa from him, ranging from being a journalist to an entrepreneur to an educator, public speaker, community activist, etc. But you'll get to know him better as we proceed in the interview. Welcome on the show, Makonnen.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to, talking to you more on the show.
It's a pleasure to have you. You know, Makonnen, colonization has been viewed as one of the major moves towards the falling down of most African nations today. Or let me say that a lot of people have different opinions about colonization in Africa, while majority term it as a selfish act by the colonial masters are taking advantage of most of African nation resources, etc. Other people are of the opinion that it has some advantage that it offers Africans till today. Let's hear from you. What impact do you think colonization has made in the African society today?
Well, regarding the impact of colonization, it has changed the structure of Africa in terms of, governance and how the countries in Africa are governed. So, historically, countries in Africa have been ruled by, kings, emperors, chiefs, and elders.
Yeah.
Whereas now you see, a model, a European system of governments that has come across into the various different countries of Africa. So I think that's one of the main areas is the system of governance, which is modeled over, a European-centric system, and a system that works for Europe doesn't necessarily reflect a system that's going to work for, African countries.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're talking about African countries as well as an example, because before colonialism, there was no such thing as this country and that country, and there was no borders in sense of Africa, for example. Africa, I'm not going to say Africa was a one whole and it was it was all singing and dancing and singing kumbaya and all of that. There's always been there's always been infighting and tribal wars and stuff like that, for example. But Africa as a whole didn't have borders, and there was movement between one country to the other country, and a lot of the turmoil that is in Africa today still stems from the reminiscence of colonization, and what people may say is a lot of things like the lack of advancement is as a result of colonization, because effectively that we're still Africa is still in a neo-colonial state. You're talking about 30, 40 years ago, the struggle for independence 50 years ago was still going on, and that's not a long time in the long state in the long run of things. And we're seeing the resources of Africa that are still being exploited to this day, whether it's stuff like cobalt in the Congo, whether it's the gold, whether it's crude oil, whether it is, Africa has got so much natural resources, but it's not working for the benefit of the people on the continent. Yeah, it's working for the benefit of people, in Europe, in other places, and abroad. And some of the turmoil that you see in parts of Africa, such as the Congo or Belgium, and these are still rooted in the colonization or the invasion of the African countries. And when you talk about the francophone countries, which I think there's about 14 francophone countries in Africa, like you have Senegal, Burkina Faso, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, and other francophone countries as well, like Ivory Coast and others. Yeah, but the colonial debt, so to speak, as in they were colonized by France. When France left those countries, they said that they're gonna, unless they're paid in compensation for the quote unquote building for infrastructure and certain things that they left the buildings, that they're gonna basically destroy the infrastructure and the buildings in those countries. And as a compromise, the African countries, they're paying back, money every single year. I think for the France Central Bank collects around 500 billion each year from, African countries. as a result of colonial debt. And there was one particular prime minister, president, that tried to refuse doing that. And, the French, they completely destroyed that, broke down that country. And to set that as an example for people that, other African countries, African leaders that are not going to follow that as an example. And when you have had other leaders that basically have said that, this is wrong, this colonial debt. What do you mean? They colonize us and we're paying them back money, for example. But you've seen that what's happened then is, the assassination of these leaders. Yeah. So this is again some of the the destabilization because of colonialism. You have the World Bank and the IMF that send money for like loan and aid, and that comes with stipulations. That Africa has to do this and Africa has to do that, which are basically rules of governing the country from the outside, because it's like, oh, you not only get the money, but if you do this, if you abide by our rules, and those kind of stipulations that come with are not necessarily in the best interest. You have the high interest loans that are done, so high loans which keep Africa more and more in debt, and loans that are not going to get paid back within a certain time, and then you have people the defaults of these loans. So the colonization has influenced Africa in many ways in terms of, spirituality. Even you could say Africa now, a lot of the countries are heavily Christianized and is Islamic. That's not to say Christianity and Islam didn't exist in Africa prior, certainly European colonization. However, how those, particularly Christian, how it is practiced today, is because of a result of the colonization of how Christianity, the way it was presented, brought back into Africa by the Europeans, and the Europeanized version of Christianity that we see. For example, like the white image of Christ is one example. You can go to churches in Nigeria where you are. I've been in churches in Gambia where you have all black people there, but you see a white image of Jesus Christ as a savior in an all black country, in a country where people these are kind of things that subliminally that colonialism has done. You can say even Arabic, let's not say Christianity, but even before the European colonization, but the Arabic invasion of Africa, and how Arabized. I'm in the Gambia now, and when you see people that have left their African names and people with Islamic names, basically, and the Arabic influence on countries, which is more like in line, with following, Arabic traditions and customs and culture, and that often points to the denigration of, African spirituality or African history, African culture. I mean, these are some of, just some of the ways that colonialism and also, the Arabic invasion has, affected Africa as a continent.
Wow, that's great. I love your sort of educative response to this. It's pretty much enlightening. Now, I'd also love to have your take on this, since we are talking about Africa's colonization. How did the social structure of African society change during the colonial era? Also, how much of these changes can directly be attributable to colonialism itself?
Well, one of the main changes that I mentioned in a previous question was, I told you, was the system of governance.
Yeah,
and
sure.
That can wholly be attributed to the colonialism. There's no ifs or buts or maybes about that here, because as I said before, the African countries were not governed like the way they were governed now before the colonialism. Yeah, with the Berlin Conference, when all these countries were divided and turned into orders, and then you had the countries which were controlled by European nations such as France, England, Belgium, Germany, and different European countries, and their system of governance, even though that they left, they still left their system of governance that they used through colonialism in place. So it's not gone back to what was the system of governance before colonialism. That is still being maintained, and these countries are generally the countries that colonized them are the countries that they are in close allegiance with. Yeah, so the countries colonized by the French their allegiance to the France. If they're colonized by the English, they've got their allegiances with the English. And then in the language that we speak as well, in societal structure, the language spoken on the continent, there is, some own like African languages, but generally, for example, like you see, Francophone countries, speak French, still speak French as well as a main language. English countries that were colonized still speak English, as a main language. Portuguese countries like Mozambique speak Portuguese, so how the language that we use in a lot of the African countries, that just shows, for example, the impact of colonialism. And even say, for example, you could say even before colonialism and Arabic invasion, which I mentioned a bit previously before, even like say in Swahili and Wolof, some of the words in those in that language is influenced by say Arabic. So these are some of the ways where the society has changed through colonialism, and also a little bit I mentioned from the Arabic invasion of Africa as well.
Wow, I love your answer to that question. Now I want to ask you sort of a similar question. Why do you think, or why has much of post-colonial Africa suffered a series of recurrent political, economic, and social catastrophe since 1980? Are all of those problems and failures, in fact, linked or connected to colonization?
I think they are linked to colonization. How Africa is in the position it is in today, and when I say this as well, for example, because Africa is a continent, not a country. Because sometimes when we think of Africa, we think about it as a country. Africa is a continent, and you know what? Africa is still beautiful and it's still lovely. But I'm saying to you why it's been held back in certain ways, and why there is certain issues and problems. There's issues and problems everywhere, but we're talking about Africa here. And what you have is that in the independence struggles in, like, say, the 60s and 70s, etc., to get independence, a lot of the leaders that were, we'll say, progressive and real staunch activists in terms of our people being free from colonial rule, not just like legally, but also in terms of social structures, in terms of our minds, and really trying to get rid of all the vestiges of colonialism, like Thomas Sankara, who's really a hero of mine, for example. A lot of them were assassinated. So you have the Sankaras, the Nkrumahs, the Lumumbas, all assassinated. So when you have African leaders that have tried to rise up and to empower and embetter Africa as a continent, and for Africa to get Africa to be free as it should be, not just legally, in terms of constitution, that kind of stuff, but when they tried to put economic clout, like Gaddafi, who wanted one currency for the whole of Africa, for example, he was killed. Robert Mugabe, when he wanted to take the land, when he took the land back from the white people who originally stole the land off the native Zimbabwean people, and the way that he was attacked by the Western media, who had nothing but good things to say about him before he took the land, and then when he took the land, all of a sudden he became was like the Black Hitler and this and that. He was knighted by the Queen of England before that, and nothing but good things were said about him. But as soon as he took the land back, as soon as ZANU-PF and the people of Zimbabwe took the land back, he was criticized, and then, for example, eventually that led to the downfall of Mugabe, and the downfall really of the Zimbabwean economy. But whenever you have strong leaders in Africa that try to do good things, Idi Amin, look what he did. He recognized the Asians in Uganda were taking too much control and too much power, so he kicked the Asians out of Uganda. And again, how the Western media portrayed him to be. So any leaders that are not working in the interests of white supremacy, of the powers that be in Europe and America, for example, they are then under an extreme amount of pressure. And often, they're killed or assassinated, and sometimes they're set up by their own people, like in the case of Patrice Lumumba. And this is the problem. And then people look at it and say, well, why can't Africa do this? Why can't Africa do that? Because when you have a strong leaders that try to rise up to empower the continent, this is the kind of result that what happens. They're killed or often assassinated.
Wow. Wow, that's quite amazing to know. I so much love to applaud you for that. Now, I want to ask you sort of question. Why do you think the European first take an interest in the African continent? I know that this might have, if you ask someone this question, they might have a lot of opinions and ideas of their reason why they think European folks take an interest in African. Why do they not go to Asia? I know probably some places were also being colonized by the European, but I want to ask you specifically, why do you think the European folks take an interest in the African continent?
Country that's rich in resources more than anywhere else on this planet. Everything you need is, in terms of resources is in Africa. There's, the crude oil, the material, the cobalt for the phone, the gold, gas, coal, iron, tin, unlimited resources. You're talking about Africa, a place, so everything, what is in terms of resources is in Africa, and that's exactly why they went there to basically exploit these resources, which they're still doing to today, because a lot of the things that we use, like I said, like the mobile phones that we use, the cobalt that comes from that we use in the mobile phone comes from the Congo, and a lot of the resources that we use, like oil and etc., that are taken with the cocoa, for the cocoa beans in places like Ghana and other parts of Africa. A lot of the things are exported from Africa. So they went there and they realized that Europe doesn't have the resources. There are parts of the world that have resources, but they're not as rich and as abundant as in Africa. So I think that is very much the reason why they went there. They saw the resources and they saw there was fertile land and for example as well, ideal for farming, because some people that settled there, like in South Africa, etc. They went there and they farmed on the land and etc. But they saw that also the climate. Why would you want to be in Europe when you've got beautiful sun and beaches? So it's also looking at those parts of Africa as well. But I mean the prime reason is the resources, because even the way that Africa was colonized in a lot of places, like say here in the Gambia, how the British have colonized the Gambia. They've colonized it. But the way that it was done is like, the routes of exportation is basically set among the river of Gambia. So for them to get the resources or to get whatever exporting out of the country, and whether it's like transport, like trailing or transportation like by a boat or onto like the coast or whatever, but a lot of things are also set in terms of the infrastructure of how they can get things, whether it's like Gambia through on the river of Gambia, where they didn't develop and build up the whole country, but they just developed that certain area where they can get resources exploited easily they're taken out of the country. So in answer to your question, it's definitely the resources which have been the main reason, which is why they invaded here and stayed here during the colonial years.
Well, I love your answer to that. And I want to actually ask you the last question on this part of the interview. I know we've actually talked about this in our previous conversation. I want to ask you, what impact has colonization and slavery have to do with the invention of religion in Africa?
How we see religion, how we do it as today, particularly with if you're looking at Christianity, for example. So first of all, there's colonialism and slavery. We'll look at them in two different perspectives, but let's say colonialism on the continent. The way that African spirituality before, you had Christianity, you had more African spirituality practices along the continent. So that's been replaced with Christianity and very much a Europeanized concept of Christianity that was being passed on by missionaries and colonizers that went to Africa. So if you look at, say, the Congo, and King Leopold, who's a Belgian people, they massacred, I think it was like 11 million people, it was millions of people in the Congo, yeah. Not a lot of people know about this, but King Leopold, the atrocities that were done in the Congo on African people by the Belgians, and they forced, the people there into labor, and then if they couldn't meet their quota, they would actually cut their hands off of the men, and they would keep the women, as prisoners, unless the man would bring back unless the man met their quota, and all kinds of atrocities were done. But they sent in Christian ministries to basically subdue the people before they carried out their actions in the Congo. And you look at, say, in South Africa with apartheid and the Dutch Reformed Church that supported slavery, and the Christianity being really looked at and used as a way to justify slavery, because it wasn't like the justification of Christianity in apartheid, not just by the Dutch Reformed Church, but by even people outside of that in South Africa, part of the the apartheid, part of that were pro-apartheid. And in terms of colonialism, the image of we mentioned this before of obviously a white Christ, in terms of the what that does to the psyche of Black people, in terms of you have countries which are predominantly Black, and then to be worshipping someone that doesn't look like you, and someone who's actually a people that are actually oppressing you, yeah, and then you're worshipping that person, yeah, that does serious damage to the psyche of our people. And it says, if you're then going to worship someone that doesn't look like you, what does that say about your self-esteem, how you look at yourself as a people, and what does that say about the person you worship? Because you must say that all those people of the other color must be godly then, because if your image of God is of a white man or of something, another ethnicity, but I'm using white man because of talking about Christianity in the image of white Christ, then that leads them to have lack of racial self-esteem, to think that if God is white, for example, that means white people must be godly and superior. That kind of subliminal message comes in, and people on the continent, a lot of Africans, for example, they can't see any concept of God as Black or anything like that. They this Eurocentric white image of a Christ. So to go to parts of Africa and places and see a white image of Christ, for example, where there's hardly, like, white people make up probably less than 1% of a population. Yeah, that's a remnants of manifestation of colonialism and neo-colonialism. So that would, I would say, in terms of how the effect of religion on linking with colonization, and still exists in some elements today. In slavery, during slavery, the way that Christianity was brought to the descendants of enslaved Africans.
Yeah.
When the descendants of slave Africans, when it was brought to the enslaved Africans, not descendants of slave Africans, the way that Christianity was brought to enslaved Africans, now on the continent, Christianity did, rudiments of Christianity existed prior to slavery. Christianity didn't necessarily just form as slavery as it came about. However, most Africans on the continent, certainly West Africa, that were captured, were not practicing Christianity until slavery. Yeah? And the way that it had been put upon them, yeah, in terms of like the white Christ, in terms of they wasn't told parts of the Bible, like Ethiopia, there's African places that are biblical in there. Yeah, it wasn't told that they was used to really, like, quotes in the Bible to keep them the slaves submissives and not want to really like rebel, and to kind of justify the reason, and to say these are descendants of Ham, and it says that or Canaan, they should be cursed, and these kind of things. So it was really used to justify and to keep the Africans submissive.
Oh, thank you so much for talking about Africa's colonization and also shedding more light on the rise of Rastafari and Life in Gambia. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.